Hello, everyone. My name is Rachel Shampoo, and I'm here with the class of 2023 for Tufts University's Gordon Institute Fundamentals of Economics, an exploration into how microeconomic and macroeconomic indicators influence global economic issues that affect our countries and our businesses. In class, we had so many rich discussions and we had numerous questions about the future of economics that we decided to put together this session to go over some of these issues. Out of those sessions, we've realized that the world is at an inflection point. While most people argue that market economies are more efficient, there are some issues that they can't deal with. And so we're trying to figure out what the future of economics looks like. The field of economics must take on these new challenges, and we will discuss some ideas in this session. I'd like to introduce each member of the class, so I'll get started. My background is in software development and government acquisition. I currently work for a small company conducting R&D in artificial intelligence and machine learning for the Defense Department. Bilal, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Rachel. Hello, everyone. This is Bilal Ali. I work in the semiconductor industry with applied materials as a manufacturing engineer. What I'd like to get out of this session is a different point of view of fundamental economics challenges, which will be discussed shortly. Over to you, Haley.
Yeah, hi, my name is Haley Strongen. I work for Keurig Dr. Pepper as mechanical engineer on the advanced development team. I'm also very excited to kind of ask some of those tougher questions tonight and really expand upon our learnings that we explored during our class. Lou, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Yes, thank you, Haley. My name is Lu, and I'm the TA for this class. Right now, I'm a full-time student at the Fletcher School at Tufts University, studying Master of International Business, and my focus is in ESG and clean energy.
Thanks, Lou. Hi, everyone. I'm Margi Patel. I'm a product development engineer at Abiomed, a medical device company that makes heart pumps. I'm really happy to be here, and I hope to both gain and offer a new and different perspectives on some of these topics that we'll be discussing today. What about you, Shri?
Thank you, Margi. Nice to meet you. Good to see you guys. My name is Sri Padamani. I work for Lonza Biologics. We're a contract manufacturing company for pharmaceuticals. I'm very excited to be here and looking to get a deeper dive into current economic issues that we're facing in the current climate.
Now I would like to introduce the mastermind behind our meeting today, Dr. Partha Ghosh, Tufts Gordon Institute Professor of Economics, Strategic Management, and Globalization. He's also a former partner of McKinsey & Company. His diverse knowledge is derived from work in more than 30 countries, solving organizational and governmental strategic challenges. To kick off our discussion, over to you, Haley, to start with the first question.
Thank you. And yeah, let's get started and dive right in. So Partha, you've had this opportunity to work on a range of economic issues, as Bilal has mentioned, and on both macro and micro level across dozens of nations. So how, as an effective policymaker and as a corporate strategist, have you had the current development and discipline to help you in your economic journey? And what do you think that the sense any voids in the discipline of economics?
Thank you, Haley. As you know very well, as a management consultant, as a problem solver, whether I was working with a macroeconomic environment for heads of states or working on heads of companies on microeconomic issues, at a fundamental level, any recommendations me or my team made involve understanding what I will call the marginal value of the resources that we encourage our clients to make, whether on a macroeconomic subject like infrastructure development, education system development, development of industrial parks, or for companies, which could mean finding a new strategic direction, often making new type of technological bets. But at the end, it always involved understanding what is the relative value that you add vis-a-vis the relative resources that you commit. And that's where the subject of economics becomes very important, because you ultimately want to maximize return on investments made, be it on development of a country, or you're talking about development of a business. So if, at the highest level, I feel it is helping uh, heads of countries or heads of companies make right strategic choices based on understanding of the economics of each of these choices. Now, if I go deep into the subject, indeed, economics helped us to understand how markets work, and that's how Adam Smith defined the power of self-interest, because as these interests come together, they synchronize, you see the beauty of development of a nation, of a community. Similarly, if you look at from the point of view of governments making policies, it's important to understand the relationships between how people respond to different kind of incentives or respond to different kind of penalties. So you could indeed shape the behavior of a community or society. Similarly, at the business level, we are talking about efficiency of business operations. As you guys know, at the end of the day, we are talking about how to make return on capital as high as possible, which is function of efficiency of capital, efficiency of labor, efficiency of machines, equipment, so on and so forth. And obviously, economics helps us to understand how well we are managing the resources. Now, I must say, though, that as much as economics has helped the development of the global economy over the last, I would say, 500 years, but definitely after the first book on economics, which was written by Adam Smith on Wealth of Nations, though there was a book written in India almost 2,500 years ago, as you guys know, it's called Artha Shastra, which is in English means treatise on wealth or treatise on wealth management. But in the recent times, I feel economics have been very Cartesian, that the approach is if you change A, you expect a change B. But as you know, the culture of people in different nations are different. Attitudes of people are very different in different nations. So when you make a change based on an understanding of one community and expect the same kind of change in another community, it doesn't work. So I think many ways economics have yet to develop the understanding of the psychology, the culture of people, and how those elements play out on economic behavior of people. I think we have to develop a better, if you will, nexus between these the soft variables and the hard variables. And I don't think we have done a great job as yet. Economics is an evolving science, evolving art. Many of you have the opportunities to contribute to that science and art. The second thing, it assumes rationality, that people behave rationally. Some of us do, some of us don't do. Even, in fact, I speak about myself. In certain situations, I've been more rational. In some other situations, I've been less rational. So economics has been a subject, particularly in the recent time, a subject of mathematics, statistics. Econometrics have been a very big subject where we are trying to build relationship between one kind of incentive vis-a-vis another kind of behavior. But it assumes that people would behave rationally. And also, the economics have not been able to make the linkages as much as I would like to see with subjects like psychology, behavioral science, sociology, because at the end of the day, it is not as much of financial engineering. It is more about social engineering, how you help societies, particularly people who are at the early stages of economic development, spend their 24 hours in a more economically productive fashion. Some societies do work hard, but economic exchanges don't take place because it is based on mutual understanding of helping each other. So those exchanges, they do not get accounted. So I think we are definitely at an inflection point, particularly with the challenge of the climate change. Economics so far did not take into account the whole issue of sustainability. How do we use natural capital? How do we leverage natural capital? So I do feel that we will see in the future an economics which is on one side what I will call higher resolution of soft factors, in other words, understanding the cultural factors in different parts of a country. The way a person behaves in Massachusetts could very well be different from middle of Pennsylvania. And we cannot expect the same kind of response to a certain kind of incentive. So we have to be extremely sensitive in a high resolution fashion, particularly on cultural, attitudinal factors, but with a holistic perspective.
That relates to my question, which is somewhat based on cultural and psychological factors. In particular, I'm wondering how society should think about its responsibility towards others. So, for example, there's a correlation that the higher a state's income tax, the lower amount that people contribute to charity. And there's some sense that there's a difference in thought about who should be taking care of people. Should it be private charities or should it be the government? I think there's pros and cons to both. How does an economist make those trade-offs about where society should think about its responsibility towards others?
Very good. I personally believe the purpose of any economic or political system is a continuous search of an enlightened state, which continuously improves the socioeconomic landscape of any society. So whatever we earn as an individual or at a corporate level or a community level, national level, has to be partially used to create a better future. Because taxation is about keeping aside, one way of looking at it is a part of your income for the betterment of yourself, of your community, of your society, of a nation. So taxation to me is good because that's how you develop the future of your personal life, your social life, your community, and your future generations. So now the question that you're asking, that how do we strike a trade-off between government spending that money that you want to set aside, which you call tax, versus suppose you are in a low tax country, you set aside yourself a certain amount of money, not for your personal gratification, not for your personal consumption, but you want to guide that money for a purpose which you care for in society. A good example is Andrew Carnegie. As you may know, Andrew Carnegie came to this country as a son of a pauper who lost his business in Scotland, came to this country, lived in Pittsburgh, built up the biggest steel company in the world. But as soon as he realized the power of his wealth, he used his wealth to set up the library system of this country, the public library system of the country. And then, of course, he created Carnegie Engineering School, which later on became the Carnegie Mellon, which is basically a merger of two institutes, the Carnegie Institute and the Mellon Institute, leading to Carnegie Mellon. So that is another approach that, yes, when I make money, I would use some of my money for a good cause, good purpose, which will help society to prosper. But unfortunately, everyone do not have that attitude. Or I may think of contributing my funds for philanthropy, which may not be what the society really needs. So I personally feel the countries which have done well, particularly if you look at Norway, Sweden, Germany, Denmark, where they have high taxation, and people have gladly supported the system because they have seen the benefit of high taxation in form of social infrastructure, the health infrastructure, the healthcare infrastructure, the education infrastructure, the physical infrastructure. And above all, if you go to these countries, you could see a certain degree of cohesion between individuals because everyone enjoys a minimum benefit of, for example, transportation, public transportation. Now, in this country, for example, people are normally a bit uh, uncomfortable with high taxes, as you know, and there's a big divide between the Republican thinking versus Democratic thinking. So I think it's all the more important that we find a way to create some common grounds as to how we look at the value of common good. Individually, it's good to succeed, but if all of us are not living a lifestyle which is respectful, which has got certain minimum standards of living, it is obviously uncomfortable. And I think people have to understand that. And that could only happen through a good education system. And it's a little bit chicken and the egg, because to build up a good education system, you need investment in public education, but then you would need to get the money from high taxation. And I think that's where perhaps we are struggling today a little bit in this country.
Thank you, Partha. I think investing money is one factor, but other factors could also be investing time or resources. So let's think about the responsibility in terms of our nation or globally, not just our society. So for example, if you consider government spending, money or these resources can go towards like aerospace and defense, or they could go towards healthcare and education, like you mentioned. Money can also go towards helping other countries in need, such as due to war, or be invested internally. But all of these factors could be seen as our responsibility. So I guess I'm wondering, how did these changes in government spending impact the spending behavior of consumers and businesses? And in turn, how does that influence economic growth?
That's a brilliant question, Margie. I think, when I think about it from a very holistic perspective or a philosophical perspective, obviously changes in government spending will affect the behavior of society. Now, what you are raising, how should that spending be targeted so that we could see a positive development of the term that I've used earlier, the socioeconomic landscape, towards a more enlightened society? Now, particularly, your question is more important as we have gotten globalized, as we are moving towards knowledge-intensive society, because now we have to make investments on behalf of the government so that some of the fundamental qualities of, for example, the American economy, its competitiveness, is driven in a strategic fashion. So if we know artificial intelligence, if we know 5G or genomics or space travel or robotics would be the driver of the future world, US have to find a way to develop an education system, develop the physical infrastructure where every company which participates in the system, they are indeed competitive. And that's why people will invest in the United States. But if that platform is weak, if that platform is fragile, and we do not have the right kind of skill base in the country, obviously the investment will move where you can find better platform, better skill base, better culture. So it relates with what we were discussing earlier. It's a very good follow-up question, that how government first earns money, which is through taxation, through different kind of fees for services. That has to be strategic, because if the taxes are too high, then people would say, well, we will move to some other countries, particularly the corporate sector. If the taxes are low, then you're not earning enough money to be able to spend money on the right purposes. So how you tax countries have to become more strategic and has to have a global perspective. And how we spend the money that we have earned through taxes, you have to be even more strategic, not only to solve today's problems or to solve, if you will, defense-related issues, which is, of course, important, but we have to think of how are we building up the long-term, if you will, the journey of the country, the socioeconomic trajectory of the country. So you have to have a perspective on the trajectory. Where do you want to be 30 years from now, 50 years from now? As a result, what kind of infrastructure do we need? What kind of skill level we need? What kind of culture we need? So indeed, we could create a dynamic which will take us there. And that's how we have to target our investment. So government spending is important, very, very important. But let me sort of draw the other side of this picture. If it is poorly managed, we let's say government earns a lot of money through taxes, but then if it is poorly managed, all goes into defense or only goes into some parts of the country. So we make the East Coast and the West Coast look good, but Middle America looks poor. Then we are creating significant unintended consequences from where we would have difficulty to come out of. So I would like to believe that long term, or we are moving towards a world where governments have to become increasingly more strategic, increasingly have a perspective. Where is the globe going? What are the other competing nations? How are they evolving? And accordingly define the course of the nation where a particular nation should go. And it's not only for the United States, this applies to every country. Recently, I published a book, which is a collection of thoughts on nation building. It is focused on India towards 100, where India would celebrate its 100th anniversary in 2047. But my fundamental focus of that book is very universal, that how should governments build nations with a strategic perspective? And it is indeed a balancing act between short term and the long term, between giving tax incentives versus earning taxes, spending money on today's problem versus investing money to create a platform for the future is indeed very important. And poorly managed, by the way, raising taxes, poorly managed economy could create inflation, create a lot of dissatisfaction with the government. And in the process, the government starts losing trust. And when government institutions lose trust, it is perhaps the most difficult place to come out of, because trust one lost is very difficult to gain. And having worked in many developing countries, I would say the difference between a developing country and a developed country at the fundamental level is the trust that developed country institutions enjoy vis-a-vis the developing or the poorer countries enjoy. There's a huge gap. And earning trust of public institutions and public programs is perhaps the most important factor in the development of a country.
Now, Partha, you're mentioning that there's a large gap between all of these different countries, but as you noted, there's a lot of influences that impact the economic growth and becoming this enlightened society. So, taking a look at it from the United States specifically, as we are now entering this new knowledge economy and beginning to grow and evolve in different ways that we've not prepared for, you do see our gap internally from an individual level, and our Gini index is growing larger. Is there a way that you can seek and help us decrease that and move it in the opposite direction?
It's, again, a very important point, because as we move towards knowledge economy, obviously, the education of people would become more and more important. The high-touch skills of individuals will become more and more important. Now, typically, what do we see? That in a knowledge economy, people who have skills, they are the guys who are developing the robots, they are the guys who are developing the computer games, they're the people who are developing social media. They're extremely busy, so much so that they do not even have the time to participate in social media or play the electronic games. But what is unfortunate, the 95% of the economy, more these products are introduced, they get locked up into the games, in social media, and in the process, they do not get really the time to meditate on issues or focus on issues, immerse on issues where they have to spend a lot of time focused on. So I feel that is creating a fundamental divide between people who develop the games and people who play the games. And that is, I'm talking about allocation of time. Now, in the process, what's happening, as you see in this country, the people who are going to good universities, good school, they go to, if they don't go to companies like Google or Facebook or Twitter, they end up going to Goldman Sachs or McKinsey's or Merrill Lynch's of the world. That's the educated class. But the other side, the uneducated class, partly because they could not participate in education, time was taken away, or we do not have good public education. Time was taken away because they are busy playing the games. And on top of that, we have drugs and many other problems that today's society is dealing with. So you're absolutely right. In knowledge economy, and if we want, and if, as we know, the knowledge economy will become more knowledge intensive in the future, it is extremely important to have a very tight, strategically oriented education system which is accessible by all, whether they live in poor communities or rich communities. The education system should be equally good and high for everyone. If not, you are absolutely right, the Gini index could be increasing. So we are not surprised the Gini index of this country has continued to increase over last literally 50 years, and more so in the last 10 years. And why so? Because we know about these problems. Funnily enough, the United States is the center of economic thinking. If you look at the Nobel Prize winners, out of 10, 7 of them are typically from the United States. But in spite of that, we see the Gini index rising. We have about $62,000, $65,000 per capita income, but Gini index is almost approaching, I think, 48, 49. That is absolutely unacceptable. And that is happening because the knowledge society, a small group has gotten well educated. The other group has been using Mrs. Bush's term, have been left behind. So I think time has come. We have to rethink first what the education system should be, and accordingly reset the entire process right from the kindergarten to higher education, and ensure that the dropouts, should they occur, the other parallel paths as we have in Germany. So we need skill level who can do just coding, may not be able to develop the new next AI or the next AR, but we do need skill levels of different types, strategically managed to support the 21st, 22nd century industries, which would be very different. But one thing we can all bet, they would be more technology intensive.
Building on the previous question, so and as you mentioned, like income inequality is an issue facing the U.S. economy. And just to give things perspective, in 2021, the Gini index raises by 1.2 since 2020 and went to 0.494. So what is the income inequality short-term and long-term effect on the U.S. economy, development, and social stability? In other words, why do we need to care about the Gini index and the income inequality?
Let me start with your last part. The reason we care about Gini index, more the gap between rich and poor, and rich at the top, poor at the base of the pyramid. If think of the pyramid in Egypt, if the base is fragile, the top would collapse someday. And we have seen Bolshevik Revolution, we have seen Mao Zedong Revolution, we have seen French Revolution, and we have gone through such revolutions when the gaps between rich and poor literally increase. Such economies are basically unstable. And to be honest with you, having seen countries like India, Brazil, it is very painful. You know, you see Rolls Royces and BMWs and Lamborghinis on one side going through poverty. It does not look good. It does not look good. So you do not. So obviously, we care about Gini index. Unfortunately, not powerfully enough. There's so much so that Gini index has increased. Whereas, you know, in countries like Sweden and Norway, the Gini index has been quite low, almost close to 20. as opposed to 48 in case of the United States. Now, you asked me a very important question, the short term versus the long term. The short term effect is obviously what is, as soon as the gap between rich and poor increases, basically we are saying the bottom part of the pyramid, some countries it could be 70%, some countries it could be 60% or 50%, are becoming relatively poorer compared to the top, right? That's what it means, which means the demand, the economic well-being and the demand that gets generated from that part of the pyramid would gradually become smaller and smaller and smaller. The economy would basically become less attractive. That's point number one, let alone if you do not care about the gap between rich and poor. Secondly, if the government cares, government would start spending on social services for the people who are left behind. Where will the money come from? Either from taxes, which the people at the top of the pyramid has to support, or often they will find not to support because there are a lot of tax loopholes, or they will participate in taking loans from banks, the government take loans, to support social welfare programs. What happens as soon as they start taking loan, the demand for money goes up. It could lead to increase of interest rate, which could ultimately lead to increase in inflation. That's the second point. And third point, of course, as I touched on earlier, maybe gradually, but you will see tremendous amount of political instability, because inequality really means there will be more frustrated people who do not trust the system. There will be strikes. There would be all kinds of political upheavals which will disturb the free flow. But let's think of the long term. Suppose we say we do not care of the short term, and often people say, well, in the short term, we have a problem, but in long term, we will be okay. Many people have that habit. Long term, we'll be okay. But it's not so, because as soon as the economic pie is declining, or let's say the base of the pyramid is becoming poorer and poorer, you get into a vicious cycle. The government starts to catch up with the social services, but you do not have enough money because the capital from such societies tend to move away, where the gap between rich and poor is increasing. That's where there's a lot of capital which has existed, countries like Brazil, countries like India, because people who have the money, they want to be in a more stable environment. So that would be one. It will create a vicious cycle of economic contraction. Secondly, that would further lead to increased poverty. That would lead to crime. That would lead to social unrest. That lead to economic structure, which you see today in a country like Venezuela, for example. And also, as you know, in the Middle East also, some of the countries have suffered from similar problems. So I think it is extremely important that countries know how to manage this Gini index, because I think more important than GDP per capita, I'd rather live in a poorer country, but significantly more homogeneous, as opposed to a rich country where top 10% has an income of $500,000 per year, whereas the bottom 70% has got $10,000 or lower per year. So that would be my response to you, Bilal, that it is indeed a very important point, and we need to find a way to manage Gini index. And we have not done well, because if you look at US, which is the biggest economy in the world, Gini index increase. China, which is the second biggest economy in the world, still it's much poorer compared to the United States, but the Gini index has increased. It is close to about 40. Now that's why Xi Jinping is talking about the prosperity of the common. That is the quote unquote term. And that way he's become unpopular, but I could see philosophically what is the message he's trying to send to not only to the 1.4 billion people in China, but to the world.
Partha, I want to build off of some of Bilal's questions. instead of the social stability to change and talk about the economic stability of the current climate. So how does the influence of the Fed to combat inflation rates affect the global economy? And also, to go off of that, how does the US and the world get out of this inflation crisis that we're in right now?
The Federal Reserve, the Fed's influence to combat inflation rates can have a significant effects on the global economy. Why? Firstly, as you know, US is the biggest economy in the world, and most of the transactions in the world is made in dollars, in US currency. So, for example, when Fed, as you know, in the last, I would say almost close to 1 year, has consistently raised interest rate to combat inflation in this country. Now, what does it mean? Apart from investments becoming more difficult to make in this country because interest rates, as they go higher, that means cost of capital is more expensive. People have become extremely cautious in investing because cost of capital is high. But think of the other countries, like countries like Brazil, Turkey, India, Pakistan, many of the countries in Africa. Most of their debts are in dollars, right? Now, when the interest rate goes up, their interest load, the load that they have to pay in terms of the interest that they are committed to, goes up. Point number one. Point number two, when US increases the interest rate, more dollar currencies, they convert their currencies into dollars because the US becomes an attractive place to invest. You want to put in money into US banks because you can collect higher interest rate. So that even more so increases the value of dollar. So as the value of dollar goes up, so the countries which has got debts denominated in dollars, there's a significant interest increase in the size of the debt in local currency. Are you with me on that? For example, let's say I'm in India, I took a loan when it was 70 rupees to a dollar. Now dollar has become 85 rupees to a dollar. The size of the loan in rupees has gone up, plus the interest rate has gone up. So it has a significant impact in almost every country because most of the countries are trading in dollars, whether we're talking about flow of investments or we're talking about flow of goods and services. The only benefit that it could offer is that because dollar has become expensive, any imports coming from other countries would look cheap to US. So US could buy more with $1 because dollar is more expensive. So countries which are now competitive, like China, like Vietnam, they could benefit. But if the country is not competitive, like India is not competitive as China is, they will get hurt because they're not being able to take advantage of high value of dollar, but they're getting hurt by the high value of dollar. But China, on the other side, fortunately do not have much external debts because China has been earning a lot of money through positive trade balance. But China will be able to export more to US, keeping aside the current trade tensions, more because US dollar is more expensive, so US dollar would be able to buy more Chinese goods now than it could have done, say, 1 year ago. So indeed, it's a very important point that when Fed manages the interest rate, it should not only think about United States, it has to think about what does it mean for various countries around the world. You know, I can talk about many of the nation building activities in Iraq, for example, in Afghanistan, for example. For that matter, I would say some of the big debts which Egypt has incurred in dollars, or Sri Lanka for that matter, they are really suffering with the increase in interest rate in this country. And again, as I mentioned, two ways: the value of dollar has gone up and interest rate has gone up. So basically your value of the principal has gone up in local currency. and you're paying more interest rate.
Now, it seems that the Fed is really playing a predominant role right now in whether or not the US is going to have a recession or not. So, do you believe that the position they're playing and how it's going to impact us and other countries, do you think that this is the role they should be doing, or they should be doing something else in addition to that? Or what's that role that you believe they should play here?
This is my favorite question, by the way. I believe that Fed should do much more than what it has been doing. But let me break it up into two parts. As per conventional expectations, Fed plays a critical role in the United States, as you know, by promoting monetary and fiscal stability. That's a fundamental role. That it should keep inflation under check, and it should also ensure that unemployment do not go too much towards the right. In other words, you want to keep unemployment under check. And it does so by regulating banks and financial institutions, by managing the Fed rate, as you know, and conducting some economic research. So basically, through monetary policies, it tries to manage inflation and unemployment. But I personally feel that was the old model of the Fed. The world has changed. As we have discussed earlier, the world has become global. The world has become knowledge intensive. In this new world, the Fed has got, I personally feel, a significantly more important role to play. Now, Fed has basically been reactive. So when Fed sees inflation is going up, it increases interest rate. Or when it sees unemployment is increasing, it decreases the interest rate with the hope that businesses would invest, so jobs would be created. In the process, unemployment rate would decrease. But that is, I would call, a reactive model and very operational model. You're basically playing it from day to day, or month to month, or quarter to quarter. But I would like to see an institution which has got so many high-class economists sitting together, who is doing research on the global economy, on the world economy. Fed should provide to the country, to the businesses, to the governments, both state as well as the Congress and the White House. If I talk in terms of the United States, in every country there's a central bank. So any of the other government institutions, they should provide a strategic guidance. I'm not saying they should control money supply, they should control interest rate, but they could strategically offer a perspective. These are the possibilities in the future, these are the dangers in the future. Accordingly, just lay out what are the ways the government of a country should be managed. Of course, they are not have the power to dictate fiscal policies or tell White House what to do, but it can always publish brilliant white papers to motivate and encourage the Congress, the businesses, as well as the White House to be significantly more proactive in build-up of a socioeconomic dynamic of a country. So that's what I would like to strongly recommend if I was running this country.
Partha, you touched on this a little bit as far as the strategy of a country, and you also talked about the trade tensions with China and the U.S. I'm curious about how we should think about the trade-off between the independence of our economy and the efficiency of our economy. So globalization has allowed countries to be pretty maximally efficient, but we've also seen that limits their independence in terms of like Europe's dependence on Russian gas. Or, for example, that the US has lost a lot of its manufacturing know-how. So how does a country balance these conflicting variables?
I think you answered the question, the balance. Balance is the key word. So when it comes to globalization, countries must strike a balance between one side, independence and interdependence, on the other side, efficiency of global resource allocation. Let me see what I can explain the word very simple terms. Now, if you look at an individual, let's say, Rachel, I'm talking about you, you should first know what you're good at and continue to be good at that. And that's what you sell to society. And on that basis, you buy, you depend on others who offer to you what they are good at. And in the process, you strike a socioeconomic dynamic. The same applies to nation. So first thing that is required, that United States as a country should know what we are good at, which we cannot sacrifice at any cost, and continue to be good at those sectors of the economy. If it's education, so be it. If it is healthcare, so be it. If it is space travel, so be it. If it is semiconductors, so be it. And you have to know what you are good at, number one. Number two, you have to know that what is strategic, that where you cannot risk a sudden disruption, which could be political in nature, a war, a technological in nature, a sudden technologies change, or it could be an economic in nature. All of a sudden, United States have been sanctioning trade sanctions on others, but it could be happening the other way around, where China could decide that we will not buy anything from the United States anymore. We have enough of the United States. We had enough of sanctions. Now we have also the right to have sanctions. So it's a tit for tat type of approach we should be prepared to deal with, which I do not believe in, because that's a zero-sum game. I believe in plus-sum game. So let me now talk about how to play the zero-sum game, which I don't believe in, but that's what the world is working with, and how to play the plus-sum game. Now, in the zero-sum game, you have to still work with other countries for seeking efficiency, the term that you have used, Rachel, of efficient resource allocation across the world. So you get things made where it is cheapest to make, you sell things where you can sell it at the highest price, and in the process, you create capital for your shareholders. That's what companies do. But as you do so, you cannot get lost to this process of efficiency of resource allocation. So much so, all of a sudden you realize you're 90% dependent on another country for supply of some strategic resources, like semiconductors. And it was a wake-up call about 1 year ago that US has to fix this semiconductor problem. But semiconductors were originally, the concept came from this country. All the semiconductor designs were from this country. The early stage semiconductors were manufactured in this country by companies like AMD, Fairchild, Intel, and Applied Materials of the world provided the base for that. But unfortunately, in the name of efficiency, in name of taking advantage of low-cost labor or low-cost manufacturing base, United States private sector made choices which led to over-dependence on one nation for a particular industry. So now so in the zero-sum game, it is important that we understand what are the strategic threats we have to deal with, and as a result, how we should balance manufacturing in-house versus manufacturing offshore. But it's important that the private sector in this mode also understand it is the responsibility of the private sector to commit to the country where they're headquartered. They create employment, they provide employment to the people of the country, and to ensure that the country is not overexposed to another country. In the plus-sum game, which is the game I would like to suggest, that every country should believe that when we synergize with each other, we create more value than +1 + 1 = 2. So there has to be that kind of enlightened economic outlook through which we create cooperative arrangements in a fashion that we are dependent on each other, yet we have the buffers in place, we have the redundancies in place. Should one country for some reason get disrupted, not because we want to go to war with them, but we saw what happened in Japan with the tsunami. The whole Fukushima crisis brought Toyota plants in grinding halt for almost 10 days. That could happen. So yes, on one side, we should be dependent on each other. On the other side, we have to build enough amount of redundancies and buffer so that the strategic industries do not get suffered with sudden disruptions, be they be natural disruptions like Fukushima, or terrorism like 9/11, or um, sudden sanctions or wars that we are seeing right now between Ukraine and Russia. So I think it's a very good question. I do believe the world has to switch from zero-sum logic to plus-sum logic. That's a very philosophical point, because so far, most of the economic development has been on the basis of if you win, I lose. If I win, you lose. Someone has to lose, because the thinking was survival of the fittest. And that means ultimately one species would survive. What I believe it is the fitness of nature. Many species together creates an economic system which is fit.
So, Partha, just to add on there and ask another question, but you talk about very strategic mindset and all these countries being able to work together in a strategic way. And to do so, you need all these balancing of these variables. So I guess my question is, as we see the economy today is stemming and emerging with emerging technologies, such as AI and robotics, do you think that our government is playing the necessary role to adapt to these? I know you mentioned earlier that we're being very reactive in some of our manners. So do you think that they need to adapt and change and work in more a proactive way to embrace this impact of these new technologies for the future?
Yeah, it's a $1 trillion question, by the way. You know, the US government, as you know, if I look at some recent years, it has taken some steps to address emerging technological changes such as AI, robotics. But I would strongly argue that the whole approach has been reactive as opposed to proactive. And where I feel ashamed that we are talking about this in a country which has got the best business schools, which teach strategic thinking, with the best public institutions like Kennedy School, Woodrow Wilson School in Princeton, the Fletcher School. They are all about strategic thinking, but the country as a whole has been reactive, not proactive. So that's at the highest level. Yes, we have been reactive, but I see some changes because, as you know, recently the CHIP Act, the Semiconductor Act, is again reaction to. But this act should have been about 15 years ago, when there was a realization that semiconductors is going to drive the future of any economy, and it is the most powerful input to any economic system. But after realizing that Taiwan Semi manufactures most of the semiconductors in Taiwan, and China is getting into manufacturing of chips, and Japan has been there, and South Korea has been in semiconductor. Now there's a wake up that yes, we have to get into chips. But I think this wake up is not enough, because it is again reactive. The real wake up would be that when the country can step back and say, hey, we have to think strategically about the future. What are those 7 industries where we want to be number one in the next 5 years, next 10 years, what would be the new industries which we do not know today even? I can think of three industries which will emerge, which no one is talking about. But Partha Ghosh is talking about, which I'll give you the secret today. But that's the kind of thinking that we have to bring to play. So if I have to choose the five, we have to be proactive in what is AI 2.0, not AI 1.0. No one is talking about that, which is the second one, not artificial intelligence. What is AI NI mix, which is artificial natural intelligence fusion? What would be those industries like? Third, industry based on which will trigger the power of imagination. And let me tell you what I mean by that. If you look at the steam engine, that basically helped people to use the physical muscle of human beings better. With less application of your muscle, you can get more done. It was a physical leverage. Then information revolution led to your mental leverage, that you could do calculations faster. You could do them, but what will take 10 hours, the machine would do it in maybe 10 seconds or 10 nanoseconds. And now we are moving into an era where AI is doing all the work, but the real power would be, what are the industries that would emerge which will sell imagination? Just think about selling imagination. And I'll go further, which I'll call spiritual machines, that we have served the brain, we have served our taste senses, the restaurant, we have served our ears and eyes, the entertainment, but what about these industries will serve your spirit? It's coming. But is there any discussion today of how to develop those industries? What would it take in the education system? What are we talking about? So, Ellie, I'm afraid while we have woken up in a reactive fashion, but we have to really wake up in a proactive fashion where we can think about the future.
This leads me to my next question, and basically the US need to start being reactive in terms of manufacturing. So the trade imbalance between the US and the China is often used in the political tension. And the deficiency is caused by importing more goods to China that's importing from China than exporting to China. So what are, in your opinion, the best domestic policies that the US can take and strategic plans in order to bring manufacturing back in the United States?
You know, Bilal, the trade imbalance between the United States and China has been a long-standing issue that has created, as rightly pointed out, a significant political tension between the two countries. But what I find interesting, in the 80s, as some of you know, I used to live in Japan. There was similar discussion about those days. The word was not trade war, it was trade friction between Japan and the United States. Why? Japan was exporting all their fantastic products, be they cars, consumer electronics, wristwatches, motorbikes, you name it, cameras, they're all coming from Japan. Now, then came Germany, and they're still coming from Germany, like BMWs, Porsche, Bosch. You know, if you go to any high-end appliance or go to any high-end home in this country, high-end home, you would see appliances, either they're Bosch or they're Miele. If you go to any garage, high-end cars are BMWs, Mercedes, Porsche. So the question is why? And I feel US has badly again failed being a long-term player. And I really do not blame the government. I blame the private sector. The private sector has always shown or chosen to take a short-term approach. And whenever some factory did not appear to be productive enough, that factory was closed down and a team was formed to find a factory in China or in Mexico, earlier days in Japan, which will manufacture the product for you. You brand it and sell it under your name. And the thinking was you do not have to invest. Let that company in China do the investments in the machinery. They will manufacture it for you because their labor is cheap, and then they will produce the product. You will put on your brand, put on your badge, and it would be selling as Apple or selling as some brand name in this country and all over the world. Now, what does it tell you? That top management has failed to make their factories productive, because it is the responsibility of top management. As the labor cost goes up, you have to make the labor more productive. We have seen that in Germany. Germany, as you know, the labor cost is higher than that of United States, but they did not close down the factories. They're producing the products and selling the products all over the world, manufactured in Germany, sold in the United States, sold in China, sold in Japan. You know, Chinese consumer loves German products. Even if you will look at a good home door handle, that comes from Germany. So the message here is the US manufacturing sector has somehow been extremely short-term oriented. They look for easy solutions, and in the process, they outsource the manufacture in the countries where their labor is cheap. But I want to be in a country where labor is expensive, because that's how the country becomes rich. But then it is the role of the top management to make that labor produce products which are high value added, produce the product with machine where the productivity is high, so the delta value divided by delta cost is continuously increasing. And that's where the subject of economics becomes very important. So now, how to get out of the problem? I think short term, maybe US government has to guide the manufacturing sector by giving some tax incentives, subsidies, financial incentives, so that manufacturing could come back. But the manufacturing sector has to take the responsibility. These companies have made a lot of money over time by outsourcing. But they would again have to be provided incentives with taxpayers' money. So I personally feel we have to get out of this virtuous cycle of quick profit-making mentality through actions which typically taking advantage of low-hanging fruits, as opposed to being strategic and thinking what is the next stage of productivity, next stage of how to make the country competitive so we can sell our products all over the world. So indeed, I think time has come, instead of blaming China and blaming other countries, United States have to look inwards to see how the manufacturing sector, the economic system is totally globally competitive. And as we have discussed earlier, it's a function of education, physical infrastructure, function of culture, and most importantly, how top management of this country has to be trained. I'm really using the word, they have to be trained. They are not making decisions which benefits the country or even many times benefits the company. Short term, they look good.
I would like to build on more questions about US and China relationship. So a lot of companies have said they would cut off China entirely from their supply chain, and a lot of Chinese companies having been losing business due to geopolitical and human rights issues. So what kind of suggestions would you give to those companies?
Those companies, you mean in China?
Yes.
Okay. It is a very interesting point. When I remember when I was at MIT as a student, I was in my 19 or 20 years old. That time, Richard Nixon sent Henry Kissinger to China to meet with Mao Zedong to basically, essentially encourage the country to open up their doors so that US and China could do business. That was in mid-1970s. Today, literally 50 years later, we are saying we should close the doors. So this again shows that United States is being reactive, that's point number one, to I would say, as we discussed earlier to Bilal's question, the trade deficit that has evolved over time, not because China has made a mistake. Chinese companies have worked very hard to meet the requirements of US businesses, the Walmarts. They negotiate very hard to bring products from China. That Apple makes products in China. They negotiate very hard with the company which is manufacturing the product to set the cost. And Chinese companies and Chinese labor has worked very, very hard to deliver products for the world. So I have a tremendous amount of empathy, having visited China many times, to all the businessmen in China and the labor in China who have worked diligently, typically 6 days a week, to produce products for the developed world and also for their domestic market. Now, unfortunately, the situation has evolved in such a way during COVID-19 and the recent China's move vis-a-vis the Ukraine-Russia war. The Chinese companies have lost, and partly because some kind of IP-related issues, Chinese companies have lost certain degree of trust with the global economic community. So that's the reality today. So Lou, the question that you asked, I hope our friends in China, including Xi Jinping, will listen to this tape, and it is meant for Xi Jinping as well as the CEOs of Chinese companies that you are concerned about, and rightly so. Firstly, I think the Chinese companies have to rebuild trust with US companies, and not only US companies, the Western European companies, the companies around the world, that we are reliable partners and we are global companies. We are not Chinese companies. The image that Chinese companies have today, that we are representing China to take advantage of the global market. But that image has to be shifted, that we are not Chinese companies, we are global companies located in China. That's a very big transition. Point number one. Point number two, it is a fact that many Chinese companies have compromised a little bit in management of intellectual property. Now, many developing countries, not only China, in the early stages, Japan had the same issue, and I know many other countries, they feel knowledge is to be accessed and you have right to gain it free. It is not free. China is becoming a developed country. In the next 30 years, it will be. So how to respect intellectual property would become very, very important. And Chinese companies should demonstrate they are committed to respect intellectual property. That's the second point. Third point, as you know, as related to TikTok and many other companies, that there is a feeling that Chinese companies are picking up a lot of private information from individuals in the United States, in Europe, which might play into the hands of the government. So there, I think the message for Xi Jinping or the president of China is that for the Chinese technology companies to prosper around the world, there should be clear separation between the government and the performance and the development of the private companies. Of course, China is a state-owned capitalism. That's fine. But when it comes to companies, whether it is Chinese government or US government or European Union government or any other government, they should maintain equidistance from all the governments. Not you have to be closer to Chinese government because I'm headquartered in China. That way I have a tremendous respect for Apple. Apple has demonstrated, and many of the US companies have demonstrated, that they know how to maintain distance from all the governments, yet work with the governments to serve the local societies. So that would be my advice for Chinese companies. And for the government, the advice would be, China has done a brilliant brilliant work from 1950 to 2022, which is 72 years of brilliant run from a country where 90% of the people were below poverty line. Today, 80% of the people are part of the middle class, maybe if not more. Very few countries, I think no country has achieved that because no country has that size of population. To lift billion people out of poverty into middle class is the first time in history. So China must continue that, but China has to transition to become a relevant country. Now I would like to see China become a revered country, revered by particularly developing countries as well as developed countries. And that is where I think the president of the country has to make a strategic shift.
Partha, you've touched on the need to redefine the education in the US to help bridge the wealth gap. And you also mentioned the need for fostering creativity and imagination to get to that next level of technological advancements and also where to focus manufacturing efforts. But diving a bit deeper, considering centralized versus decentralized education systems, what is the relationship between the quality and availability of education on the US and also on the global economic growth?
You know, there's a growing consensus, Margie, that the general education system in this country needs an overhaul. I hear that in various quarters when I go to meetings, whether I'm in California or whether I'm in Washington or whether I'm New York or Boston. But unfortunately, that has been in the discussions for the last, I would say, 25 years, but nothing much has changed. So let's see, what are the changes required? Firstly, as you may know, in general, if you look at last 100 years, 150 years, US has been the leader in education. You know, that's why you've seen so many Nobel Prize winners. You've seen so many startups. 90% of the technologies of the world has come from the United States in the last 100 years. Whether we are talking about penicillin, whether we are talking about light, whether we are talking about cars, whether we're talking about space travel, airplane, internet, social media, you name it. So obviously, US has done something right. But when you look at today, the comparison between education system, particularly the high school level, between Japan, eastern part of Asia, China, Singapore, parts of Europe, and look at the United States, the United States will continue to decline, particularly when we're talking about the high school system. Though this country was the first country in the recent times to have free schooling until high school across the country. So I feel time has come to change the overall approach, and that has to begin from K-12, point number one. And the focus has to be significantly more on holistic approach to education, particularly as you know earlier when Haley was talking about artificial intelligence and robotics, how to become competitive. We have to ensure the STEM education is given a tremendous emphasis in the early stages. That's point number one. Point number two, it is important to ensure that the level of education across, whether you're living in a rich environment or a poor environment, the education system should be equally good. And that should be the responsibility of the central government, not the local towns. Local town can offer the infrastructure. That's the decentralized approach. But the content of the education, the quality of the teaching staff, the faculty, that has to be at least centrally guided, centrally audited, but managed by the local towns, the local villages. So that on one side, we retain the sanctity of the decentralized approach, but we do not lose the importance of a strategic guidance from the top. And as far as the higher education is concerned, I would like to see there's more emphasis on interdisciplinary approach. Because today, when we are talking about the environment, when we are talking about education, it is not just mechanical engineering or computer engineering. It is a convergence of multiple disciplines. So we have to teach people how to embrace multiple disciplines, connect with each other, and in the process create a collaborative approach. So that will be my quick answer to this question.
Partha, we've talked about a lot of things in this session. What challenges do you think Nobel Prize winners or future Nobel Prize winners should address in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, let's see. I mean, I think we have covered some of the points. If you look at the challenges that we are facing today, I always think of 3 E's. One is equality. The gap between rich and poor has increased. Second, ecology, which is the climate change. The climate is behaving, as you know, in a very random fashions. Climate is upset, in other words. That's I'm taking a bit of a divinatic approach. The mother nature is upset. That's very clear. And third thing that is happening very rapidly is technological disruptions are happening more rapidly. What does it mean? The fourth, the globalization has happened over the last 2,000 years and it will continue to happen. But the content of globalization is changing. As you could see today, we are globalized, but yet we have got a lot of doubts. We want to inshore, but yet we want to maintain offshore relationship. So the content of globalization would change, but new form of globalization would emerge. And then we have the challenge of the healthcare. Because as you know, the healthcare system, even in a country like United States, which almost spends $20,000 per capita per year on healthcare, but the healthcare system is quite weak. Health of the country is actually not as good as it could have been compared to countries like Germany or Sweden or Norway, where the spending is about half. So if these are the 5 issues, I would like to see the people who are working on economics. I don't know who will win the prize. Maybe this discussion should win the Nobel Prize. But I personally feel I like to see people connect on the softer and more deeper factors of the socioeconomic development of the world, the development of the civilization, that how do we take climate and natural capital into account in defining economic equations? How do we manage economic prosperity where everyone can participate in that process? What will the design of economic processes where everyone gets equal opportunity? I don't believe in wealth distribution, but I do believe in distribution of economic opportunities. So everyone will have it. Now, if I cannot take advantage of it, so be it. I did not take advantage of it, but I should have access to the opportunity. So I think that those are the kind of subjects I think economists of the future should work on. And in the process, if they come up with some outstanding idea, they will get the Nobel Prizes that they deserve. And I feel the nature of the discussion today has been so rich. I hope this would reach the Nobel Committee so that all of you become participant of a Nobel Prize.
Yeah, I guess, one more question to continue on this future discussion. Given recent events like the COVID-19 global pandemic and the Russia-Ukraine war, potential recession and the state of the housing market even, what lessons can we learn from these events? And how can we as a nation and as the human race better prepare for the future?
These recent events, when I look at the COVID-19, I was quite active in terms of giving a lot of different talks around the world, of course, on Zoom on COVID-19, and then the Ukraine-Russia war happened. I think it highlighted in my mind 2 very important points. One term I would use would be a kind of socioeconomic preparedness. The word one of you used earlier, the socio-economic resiliency, so that we could quickly respond to sudden changes. That's one. And second is the importance of collaboration and cooperation. So if we look at COVID-19, for example, COVID-19, I think we could quickly solve the problem. It was a very, very dangerous virus, as you know. But in 3 years' time, we were able to bring it under control. And it was largely possible, not at the early stages, but in much of the last 18 months because of global cooperation and how countries came together to share information, share resources, share expertise to deal with the pandemic. Similarly, if I look at the Ukraine-Russia war, which is very unfortunate, really unfortunate, my heart goes out to everyone in Ukraine, which is literally living through a nightmare every night and every day. And of course, the Russians who are losing their lives just because of one person. I think what world has shown that how we have come together in support of Ukraine, though there are few exceptions, but generally the world has come together to support it. So collaboration to solve problems, I think, is something that I've learned. We have done a great job. But on the other side, not great enough to stop the war. On the other side, the COVID-19 has taken about 1.5 to close to 2 million people out of this world. So, but we learned how to collaborate, how to work. The second thing that we are not good at, which has been much of the discussion today, that how could the world be more proactive, more predictive? We use the word predictive analytics, we use the word being proactive, being strategic. But when I look at how the world is performing, I feel we are falling short. So I think we have to learn how to be prepared for sudden disruptions, what might be the nature of disruptions that we have to deal with, and as a result, what kind of redundant engineering or buffer engineering, whatever you call it, that we have that ability to accommodate sudden changes and respond very rapidly. So that is the second thing I would like to see we learn. The third thing that is coming to, it may be sounding very philosophical. The world is upset. I think the world, when you look at the natural disasters which are happening and the angry people that we see, all the mass shooting that is happening in one of the most developed countries of the world, United States, it is telling me something. That Mother Nature is definitely sending a signal we need to reset. Reset in fundamental terms so that people do not have to lift guns to feel safe. An enlightened society would do not have to even think of fighting with anyone. They should be able to cooperate with each and everyone. They should be able to synergize their thoughts. They should be able to collaborate. But just to think that gun is important because of a constitution that was written 250 years ago, I think it's height of stupidity. So I feel these are becoming more evident, and we have to have the courage to take on some of the fundamental issues which people think are straight line extensions of the past. I think we need new S-curves, a discontinuous change. We cannot, rely on the Constitution, whether Article 1 or 2 or 3, I don't care. But Constitution was written at a time it was very different. There was no social media. There was no so many powerful guns. It was a very different world. So we have to learn how to reset many of our fundamental equations, which are kind of defining the challenges of today.
Partha, you've often talked about the need to develop economic systems beyond what nations have already worked on, like state-driven resource allocation and the market-driven resource allocation or capitalism. Any comments or thoughts on that?
Well, as you know from our economics class, that over the last 200 years, First, we talked about, what Adam Smith kind of talked about in his book, Wealth of Nations, the power of self-interest. And it worked as the Industrial Revolution took place. We worked on division of labor. We talked about economies of scale. And then in the meantime, Karl Marx came up with the theory of that if people only keep producing what they're producing, they will themselves get commoditized. So we need to ensure that there's a balance between capitalism, and he came up with the concept of socialism or communism. And there's been a debate over the last 200 years whether we should be more capitalistic or we should be living in a country where the government decides what is good for the society and accordingly makes resource allocation. But as you know, we have come a long way from there. We are living in a world which is no longer limited within one nation or one kingdom. Those theories developed where there were still some kind of kingdoms, some countries, and America just got liberated in 1776 when Wealth of Nations came up. So now we are living in an economic system which is very different. And I personally believe that socialism did not work, though the intentions were very good, because when the power gets concentrated in few individuals, the ethics gets compromised. That's one, socialism. On the other side, capitalism, as you know from the Occupy Wall Street movement, which happened in 2008, 2009, and if you look at the US economy with the increasing wealth gap between the top 2% and the bottom 90%, it says capitalism is perhaps also running out of steam. So I personally believe that there's a new kind of ism which is possible. And that ism is based on what I would call the network economy, where instead of the economic systems developing around cities, so far the Wall Street or New York City has been the power of the market. That market decides how the wealth should be distributed. Or in a communistic system, Moscow is to decide how wealth has to be distributed. But now, I think small towns and villages connected through the 5G, 6G, 10G, with solar panels, wind power, with micro turbines, we can create a network economy where the power of resource allocation is in each of the cells, economic cells, small cells, but connected with each other. So which I'm calling cellularism. So it is still freedom, but freedom at a village level in small towns, suiting the local ecosystem. And you create small economic activities where you celebrate what Schumpeter is to call small is beautiful. So I think we can do that today. We have the technologies, we have the connectivity, we have the solar power to be able to create a network of global community. But each community has the ability to make choices in relationship with the local ecosystem. That's very important. So if you ask me, we need a fundamental change at multiple levels of our existence. But the most important change has to come at the individual level, at your and my level, because in the past, we have put self ahead of society, power of self-interest, which Adam Smith is to talk about. We have put human above nature, and we have put instant gratification above gradual evolution. That's why you have instant tea, instant coffee, you have a lot of instant. Now, these days, when you use your iPhone, if the iPhone is a bit slow, you get upset, you keep hitting the button 10 times. That's the culture we have moved in. I think we have to come out of that to what I would say we have to put self below society, not above society. We have to put human not above nature, below nature. And we have to put instant solution below gradual long-term solution. And if you notice the nature of the discussion we had today, we are talking about evolution. We are talking about long-term thinking, strategic thinking. So individual level, I like to see that kind of change while we celebrate the power of cellularism.
Well, thank you, Partha, and thank you everyone for this stimulating discussion on macro and microeconomics and for bringing up such tough but important questions. To summarize, we've touched a wide range of topics today, including taxation, wealth gap, government spending, inflation, globalization, current events, and also the future of economics. I think one common thread throughout these discussions is the importance of understanding the complexities of economic behavior and policy and how they can impact individuals and societies. Looking into the future, our discussion emphasized the importance of continuing to innovate and evolve our economic theories and practices, especially in this fast-paced, ever-changing world. And considering a variety of factors such as new tech, shifting demographics, people's culture and attitudes, it's essential that we have the right skill set and a solid infrastructure, the framework to understand and navigate these changes. Partha, any final thoughts?
Well, I think you have summarized it beautifully. But the only final thought would be, I look at you guys as the flagship. You'll build the flagship of the future and carry the flagship into the future. And the key thought that comes to my mind based on the question that you have raised is basically one, which is, I think we have to move from a nature of relationship we have that nature was exploitative, zero sum. We exploit nature, we exploited each other. That's why Karl Marx was concerned about the people, the factories in England and Germany where the workers were getting exploited, and that was the thinking. So we have to move from the exploitative zero-sum game to, I would say, enriching. Again, the word is with E, but from exploit to enrich to plus-sum game. And if we could develop a new economic system which focuses on enrichment, not exploitation, which focuses on plus-sum synergies as opposed to zero-sum game, I think we would be able to create a world which I think we deserve, because after all, a lot of intelligence is available now, on not only 8 billion people's natural intelligence, but a lot of artificial intelligence as well. So if we can synergize AI with NI, we could create a world which is intelligent and enlightened. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much.